I never thought I'd be here, sitting next to my father on a night shift in the middle of this vast national park, miles away from civilization. To be honest, I didn't even know if I wanted to be here. It wasn't just about the forest or the strange stories I'd heard growing up. It was about him. It had been years since we really talked, and even longer since I felt like I understood him. My dad, John, had always been distant, more comfortable with trees and wildlife than with his own son. Maybe that's why I said yes when he offered to let me come along. Maybe I was hoping we could bridge that gap. Or maybe I was just looking for a thrill. The drive to the park felt longer than it should have. We barely spoke. The radio hummed low in the background, a static-filled country song drifting in and out. But neither of us bothered to fix it. My dad, a park ranger for as long as I can remember, kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in that same stern way that used to make me feel like a kid who did something wrong. I watched the trees blur past, thick and shadowed under the fading light, wondering what he was thinking, wondering if this was just another night for him, or if, like me, he was hoping for something more. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in twilight. The air was cool and heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes every sound seem sharper. My dad stepped out of the truck without a word, grabbing his gear from the back. The cabin stood small and isolated, its wood dark and worn from years of weather. It was nothing like the visitor centers or the campsites where families stayed. This place was deeper in, far from any of the usual trails. As I looked around, I couldn't help but feel like we were crossing into something older, something that didn't want us there. "We're here," my dad said flatly, as if I hadn't noticed. He handed me a flashlight and a crumpled piece of paper. "You'll need this." I unfolded the paper, squinting in the dim light. There were a few sentences, handwritten in my dad's blocky scrawl. Rules, apparently. "Don't go outside if you hear the first whistle," it said. "If you hear the second, stay put, no matter what." I raised an eyebrow and glanced at him, but he was already heading toward the cabin, unlocking the door. "What's this?" I asked, following him inside. "Just rules," he replied without looking back. "Things you need to know if you're going to stay out here. It's different in the park at night, you'll see." I wanted to push for more, but there was something in his tone that stopped me. My dad wasn't a man of many words. He never had been. I figured I'd learn soon enough. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little irritated. I wasn't a kid anymore, and the idea of following some weird set of rules didn't sit well with me. I tossed the paper onto the small table by the door and started to unpack my bag. The cabin was bare, functional. A couple of old chairs, a wood stove, and a tiny cot that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and earth. My dad moved around like he knew the place inside and out, lighting a lantern and checking the windows. I sat down, fiddling with the flashlight, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping into my gut. Maybe it was just the quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside seem louder than it should be. After a while, my dad sat down across from me, his face half hidden in the dim light. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of the years between us hanging heavy in the air. I could tell there was something he wanted to say, something important, but the words never came. Instead, he stood up, grabbed his jacket, and opened the door. "I'm going to check the perimeter," he said, glancing back at me. "Stay here and remember what I told you. The rules." Before I could say anything, he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness outside. I stared at the door, his words echoing in my head. The rules. I didn't know if he was serious or if this was just some strange ranger initiation, but the way he said it left a sour taste in my mouth. I reached for the paper again, reading the rules over, trying to make sense of them. The first whistle, the second. It didn't make any sense. Why would a whistle matter? That's when it happened, the silence. At first, I didn't even notice. It was gradual, like the forest was holding its breath. The usual night sounds, the crickets, the breeze through the trees, just stopped. It was as if someone had hit mute on the world outside. I stood up, moving to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows and stillness. My skin prickled. I'd never heard silence like this before. It wasn't natural. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding harder now. I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the dim cabin like a knife. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched, like something was just beyond the trees, waiting. I glanced down at the rules again, my hands shaking slightly. What was I supposed to do if? The whistle, soft at first, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. A sharp, high-pitched note cutting through the silence. My breath caught in my throat. The first whistle. My dad's voice echoed in my mind. Don't go outside if you hear the first whistle. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my eyes darting to the door. The whistle came again, louder now, closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. The whistle came again, this time louder, sharper, and more insistent. It cut through the silence like a knife. I stood frozen, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. My father's words echoed in my mind. Don't go outside if you hear the first whistle. But as much as I tried to convince myself, this was just some trick, some weird ranger initiation to scare me, the growing tension in my gut told me something else entirely. This wasn't a joke. Not anymore. Then, as if on cue, I heard it. A voice. My father's voice. It drifted in from outside, calm and casual, calling my name. Ethan, come out here for a second. I stopped breathing for a moment. My brain was struggling to keep up. He couldn't be back already, could he? He'd only left a few minutes ago, and I hadn't heard the door open or close again. Something wasn't right. I took a hesitant step toward the window, shining the flashlight into the thick darkness outside. The beam flickered as it swept over the trees, landing on a figure just beyond the cabin's clearing. It was my father, or at least it looked like him. He stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, his face shadowed by the trees. But there was something off about the way he was standing. His movements were too still, too rigid, like a puppet waiting for someone to pull the strings. Ethan, come on out, the voice said again, slightly more impatient this time. But it was the same voice, my father's voice. Only it wasn't. It couldn't be. Something in my gut screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door and wait for the real him to come back. But a part of me, the part that was still holding on to some small thread of skepticism, wanted to believe it was him. Maybe he'd forgotten something. Maybe he needed my help. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of doubt clouding my thoughts. The rules. I couldn't ignore the rules. He'd made it clear. Don't go outside after the first whistle. I backed away from the window, keeping the flashlight aimed toward the figure. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, the figure took a step forward. Slowly, deliberately, like it was testing the boundaries of my fear. Ethan, come on, it repeated, a hint of frustration creeping into its tone. The way it said my name sent chills down my spine. It was too perfect, too rehearsed, like a recording of my father's voice being played back to me, but with something dark lurking underneath. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I kept backing away until my back hit the cabin's wall. My mind was racing now, and I couldn't stop the rising panic from taking hold. I glanced at the door, wondering if I should lock it, but before I could move, the pounding started. Hard, heavy knocks against the wooden door, shaking the small cabin with each hit. My father, or whatever it was pretending to be him, was right outside, hammering on the door with an unnatural force. Ethan, open up. Let me in. The voice was angry now, demanding, nothing like the calm, distant tone my real father used. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. My pulse was racing, and for a brief moment, I thought about running. Just opening the door and making a break for it, hoping that whatever was out there wouldn't follow me. But then I remembered the rules. The second whistle. The paper had said to stay put, no matter what, if I heard the second whistle. And just like that, as if it had been waiting for me to remember, the second whistle echoed through the night. Low, long, and distant, but unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The pounding stopped, and the voice outside went silent. I didn't dare move. The cabin felt colder now, like something had seeped in through the cracks in the walls. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding loud in my ears, but nothing else. The silence that followed the second whistle was deeper, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen, for the door to burst open or the windows to shatter. But nothing came. Eventually, the tension broke, and I allowed myself to breathe again. Slowly, cautiously, I crept back toward the window and peeked out. The figure, my father's imposter, was gone. The clearing was empty, just trees and darkness. No signs of movement, no whispers of wind, just the same eerie stillness that had blanketed the forest when we arrived. I didn't know what to think anymore. My mind was a jumble of fear, confusion, and disbelief. I wanted to believe my father would come back soon, that he'd explain everything, and this would all make sense. But deep down, I knew that whatever had just tried to get inside wasn't human. It couldn't have been. And I had no idea if my real father was out there, or if something worse had happened to him. I sank down onto the cot, still clutching the flashlight, and stared at the door. The rules, as strange as they were, had kept me safe. For now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. If that thing had been able to mimic my father so perfectly, what else could it do? What other dangers were lurking out there in the darkness, waiting for me to make a mistake? The night stretched on, long and oppressive. I kept waiting for my father to return, for the real him to come back through the door and tell me it was all over. But as the hours passed and the cabin remained silent, doubt crept in. Maybe he wasn't coming back. Maybe I was truly alone out here, surrounded by things I didn't understand and couldn't fight. And then, just when I thought the silence would last forever, I heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. My father's steps. The door creaked open, and there he stood, John, looking tired but unharmed, his eyes scanning the cabin as if checking for something. "You're okay," he said, his voice steady but tinged with relief. "Good. You didn't open the door, did you?" I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. We need to talk." Morning came slower than I expected, as if the night was reluctant to let go of its grip. The pale light filtering through the cabin window wasn't much of a comfort. It didn't wash away the terror of what had happened the night before, nor did it erase the sound of that whistle or the pounding at the door. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the events in a loop, questioning everything. My dad hadn't offered any real explanation when he returned. He had just sat down quietly, telling me to rest and assuring me we'd talk in the morning. But now that daylight had arrived, it didn't seem to bring any clarity. I was still sitting on the edge of the cot when the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. My dad had stepped out earlier, muttering something about checking the perimeter, but I hadn't dared ask if he thought the creature from last night was still lurking out there. I glanced out the window and saw an old park ranger truck pulling up, dust kicking up behind it as it came to a stop. A man stepped out, grizzled, older, and moving with the kind of stiffness that told me he'd seen more than his share of hard days. Frank. I recognized him from a few family gatherings years ago, though I don't think we ever exchanged more than a few words. Frank walked up to the cabin with slow, deliberate steps, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. He had the same weathered look as my dad, like the forest had carved lines into his face over the years. But today, he wore a look of concern, something deep and unsettling etched into his features. As he stepped inside, his eyes immediately landed on me. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice gravelly but not unkind. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how true that was. Frank's gaze flicked to the table, where the crumpled set of rules still sat. His mouth tightened into a thin line as he picked them up, scanning the paper with a quiet sigh. "I told your dad this wasn't a good idea," he muttered under his breath. "Too much out here that can go wrong, especially at night." Before I could ask him what he meant, my dad appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He gave Frank a slight nod, and the two men exchanged a glance, one of those wordless conversations that only people who've worked together for years can have. "He needs to know," Frank said, his voice low but firm. My dad rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable, before finally sitting down across from me. "You should have never been out here," Frank continued, looking directly at me now. "Not with the way things have been lately. We've had too many disappearances, too many signs that something's stirring. Your dad might not have told you everything yet, but this forest isn't like the others. It's old, and it has its own rules. I wanted to ask what he meant by disappearances, but the knot in my stomach told me I didn't really want to hear the answer. My dad shifted in his seat, clearly not thrilled about this conversation. I brought him because I thought he needed to see. He's grown up hearing the stories, but you don't understand it until you've been out here. Frank shook his head, his face tight with frustration. You don't need to see it to believe it. This place doesn't care if you believe. It just takes. His words hung in the air, heavy with a warning I couldn't fully grasp. I glanced at my dad, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he remained silent. That silence, more than anything, made me realize just how serious this was. Frank took a step closer, his eyes softening as he looked at me. Listen, Ethan, whatever you saw last night, whatever you heard, it wasn't real. Or at least it wasn't him, he said, nodding toward my dad. There are things out here that can mimic. They'll use the voices and faces of the people you know. That's how they get you. But they're not human. You understand? I swallowed hard, my mind racing back to the figure outside the cabin, the thing that had looked just like my dad, but felt so wrong. What do they want? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Frank exchanged another glance with my dad, and this time, it was my father who spoke. They don't want anything, really. They just exist. But when people don't follow the rules, they make mistakes. And that's when the forest takes them. The weight of his words settled in my chest, cold and heavy. It was hard to believe, and yet, after last night, it made a sick kind of sense. This wasn't just about the forest being dangerous. There was something here, something old and alive in a way that wasn't natural. The rules weren't just superstition, they were survival. Before I could ask more, Frank's radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. A voice came through, panicked and shaky, mentioning a missing camper. Frank's face darkened as he listened, and my dad was already on his feet, grabbing his gear. We've got to go, he said, his voice clipped. He looked at me, his eyes serious. Stay here, Ethan. Don't leave the cabin. You've seen what's out there. I opened my mouth to argue, but Frank cut me off. Listen to your dad, kid. You're safer inside. His tone left no room for debate. Within minutes, they were out the door, the sound of the truck's engine fading into the distance as they sped off into the forest, leaving me alone once again. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were pressing in. I paced the floor, my mind replaying Frank's warning over and over. Something about his words, about things in the forest that mimic people, made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the image of that thing outside, calling my name in my father's voice. And now, with them gone, I was left with nothing but my thoughts and the suffocating silence that always seemed to settle over this place. Hours passed, though it felt like days. I couldn't sit still, my nerves too frayed to allow for any kind of rest. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, set my heart racing. I kept expecting to hear the whistle again, or worse, that same voice, calling for me to open the door. But instead, something else happened. A knock, soft, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't like the pounding from the night before. This was gentle, almost polite. My stomach churned as I moved toward the window, peeking out through the narrow gap in the curtains. There, standing just outside the cabin, was a woman. She had long, ginger hair that seemed to glow in the fading light, and she was dressed in simple, weathered clothes, like someone who'd been living off the land for a long time. She didn't look dangerous, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood, so still and patient, as if she had all the time in the world. "Are you all right in there?" she called out, her voice calm and even. "I can help you, if you need it." I didn't move. I didn't say a word, because something deep inside me, something primal, told me not to trust her. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out at the ginger-haired woman. She didn't move, didn't try to open the door, just stood there with her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting. Her face, framed by that fiery hair, looked calm. Too calm. Like none of this bothered her. Like being out here, deep in the woods where things whispered your name in the dark, was just another day for her. I should have asked her who she was, what she wanted, but my gut was screaming at me to stay silent. I'd seen enough already to know that things out here weren't what they seemed, and even though she looked human, something about her made my skin crawl. Her voice, when she spoke again, was soft, like she was trying to coax a frightened animal out of hiding. "You don't have to be afraid, Ethan," she said, her tone soothing, but with an edge I couldn't quite place. "I know what's out here. I know how it works." My heart skipped a beat. She knew my name. She wasn't just some lost hiker or camper. No, this was something else. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on her as I grabbed the flashlight from the table. My hands were shaking, but I didn't dare turn it on. The last thing I wanted was to draw more attention to myself. "Your father and Frank aren't coming back," she said, her voice cutting through the growing tension in the cabin. "Not unless you help them." That stopped me in my tracks. I froze, my mind racing. How did she know about my father? About Frank? She couldn't have seen them leave. Could she? No, something else was going on here. Something far more dangerous than I'd realized. I moved toward the door, slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. "What do you mean?" I called out, my voice hoarse from the hours of silence. I hated how small and unsure I sounded, but fear had its claws in me, and I couldn't shake it. "They're trapped," she said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You're the only one who can get them out." My chest tightened as 1,000 questions slammed into me at once. Trapped? Trapped where? And how did she know? Was this another trick? Another game like the one the imposter played last night? I gripped the door handle, my mind spiraling between doubt and desperation. As much as I didn't trust her, as much as every part of me wanted to shut her out, I couldn't ignore the sickening thought that she might be right. Maybe my father and Frank were in danger. Maybe they needed me. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. I couldn't see her face anymore, but I could feel the weight of her answer before she even spoke. "You'll have to go into the forest," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "but not alone." I frowned, confusion prickling at the back of my mind. "Not alone? What do you mean?" Another silence, this one longer, heavier. Then, without warning, she was gone. No footsteps, no sound of retreating into the trees. Just gone. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, and scanned the clearing. But there was no trace of her. It was like she had never been there at all. For a moment, I stood in stunned silence, trying to piece together what had just happened. My mind was spinning, trying to process her words. Go into the forest, not alone. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. If there was a chance, any chance, that my dad and Frank were in trouble, I had to help them. Even if it meant stepping into the unknown. I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on as I shoved the rules back into my pocket. The flashlight felt heavy in my hand as I opened the cabin door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The forest loomed around me, quiet and still, but not in the way it had been last night. This silence felt different, less oppressive, but no less dangerous. I hadn't gone more than a few steps when I heard movement behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, expecting to see the ginger-haired woman, or worse, the imposter. But instead, I found myself face to face with Frank. He was breathing heavily, his face pale and drawn, as if he'd been running for miles. "Ethan, we have to go," he said, his voice tense. "Your dad's in trouble." I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Frank? How did you? Where's my dad?" "There's no time," he snapped, his eyes flicking nervously toward the tree line. "Something's coming. We need to move." I hesitated for only a second before nodding. Frank had been out here longer than I had. If he said we needed to move, then we needed to move. Together, we plunged into the forest, the trees closing in around us as we followed the narrow trail deeper into the heart of the park. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun had barely risen. "Frank, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep up with his long strides. "The woman, she said something about my dad being trapped. What's happening?" Frank didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the trees like he was expecting something to jump out at us at any moment. "Your dad went too far," he finally said. "There's a place deep in the forest where the rules don't apply anymore, where the forest starts making its own decisions." I stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean, the rules don't apply?" He shook his head. "You'll see. Just stay close. And whatever you do, don't stop." We pushed further into the trees, the trail becoming harder to follow as the undergrowth thickened. The air felt heavier here, like it was pressing down on me, slowing my movements. Frank didn't seem to notice, his pace quickening as we neared a bend in the trail. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to keep up, even as my legs ached and my lungs burned. And then we reached it, the clearing. It was the kind of place that made you want to turn around and run, but you couldn't look away. The trees were older here, gnarled and twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss, and the air felt colder, sharper, like it had been drained of warmth. And in the center of it all, standing motionless, was my father. "Dad," I called out, my voice cracking. But he didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, staring into the trees, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Frank grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "You need to choose, Ethan," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The forest won't let both of them leave. It's either him or me." My stomach dropped. "What? What are you talking about?" "There's no time," Frank said, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name. "One of us has to stay. The forest demands it. You have to choose." I stared at him, my mind reeling. Choose? How could I choose? This wasn't a choice. This was madness. But as I looked at my father, standing there like a statue, and then back at Frank, I knew he was right. The forest was alive, and it wanted something from me. It wanted a sacrifice.